You often picture these autocratic regimes as, these solitary islands, right? Each dealing with its own problems.
Yeah, kind of isolated.
But what if they're actually, well, deeply connected? Think about Belarus. It gets slammed internationally for its elections.
Uh-huh.
But China's still investing. Russia, Iran, Cuba, they're all offering political support.
Right. And then there's Venezuela,
Yeah.
hit with sanctions by the U.S., Europe.
Yet it keeps getting loans from Russia, oil deals with Iran, surveillance gear from China. We're talking huge sums, billions of dollars, keeping this mutual support going.
Exactly. And the fascinating thing, as Anne Applebaum argues in Autocracy, Inc., is that they're not just like neighbors. They're actively collaborating.
Your network.
A network, yeah. Dictatorships working together for their own benefit, basically, to stay in power.
That's exactly what we're digging into today. We're using Applebaum's analysis plus other sources to really understand this Autocracy, Inc.
How does it work? What's the motivation?
And what does it all mean for democracies? We know you want to get up to speed on complex stuff quickly, so we'll pull out the key insights without getting lost in the weeds.
Because this isn't just a few bad apples, you see. It's systemic. A real challenge to the democratic world order.
And to understand it, we need to go back a bit. Look at the history, starting with something seemingly normal, like trade.
Right. Applebaum brings up that Soviet gas deal back in 1967 with Western Europe.
That's a really key example, isn't it? On the face of it, pretty simple economics. West Germany, Austria, they needed gas.
And the Soviets needed hard currency.
But it sparked this huge debate.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You had the realpolitik type saying, look, it's just business, economic benefits.
And the other side.
The idealists warning about, well, the morality of it and the risk, becoming dependent on the Soviets. What about blackmail?
Yeah, those arguments sound pretty familiar today when we talk about trade with, say, China.
They really do.
And there was that deeper ethical thing, too, wasn't there? Like, was this trade actually helping prop up the Soviet state?
Helping fund its goals.
Yeah, goals which included undermining those very European democracies buying the gas, supporting communist groups, cracking down in Eastern Europe.
While Western Europe paid for the gas. It raises questions about the hidden costs, doesn't it?
So what was the hope back then with engaging countries like Russia and China economically?
Well, the big idea, especially after the Cold War, was that economic ties, trade, investment, it would naturally lead to political liberalization.
Oh, totally. I remember Clinton saying something about China and the internet, how they couldn't control it.
Right. The belief was sort of economic progress equals political freedom, almost automatically. Even Gerhard Schroeder, the German chancellor, talked about seeing democratic progress in China.
But it's not quite how it panned out, did it?
Not really. Instead of widespread liberalization, we saw the rise of what Applebaum calls autocratic kleptocracies.
Kleptocracy.
Yeah.
Government by thieves, essentially.
Basically, yeah. Regimes where the main goal is enriching the leaders, the inner circle. That became the focus, especially in Russia and China.
And Putin's Russia, she argues, became a kind of new model for this.
A fully formed autocratic kleptocracy, almost like a mafia state, where enriching the leadership is the core purpose. Not just corruption on the side, but the system itself.
And where did this model come from?
Applebaum traces some roots back to Putin's KGB days in Dresden, setting up secret networks, financial channels. And that early Russian capitalism, well, it wasn't exactly a level playing field. It heavily favored insiders, people connected to the state.
She mentions that St. Petersburg food scandal in '92, Putin was deputy mayor.
Yeah, a really foundational story. He gave out export licenses for valuable stuff, timber, metals.
Supposedly to buy food for the city. It was a tough time then.
That was the story. But the goods got sold and the money just disappeared into accounts linked to his friends. It's like the creation myth of this whole system.
And a crucial point Applebaum makes is how Western institutions kind of enabled this.
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Western companies bought the stuff, no questions asked. Western regulators often look the other way at dodgy contracts.
And the banks.
Western banks seemed happy to take these huge, sudden influxes of cash.
That pattern continued, didn't it? The Rosneft IPO in London.
Yeah, that's another big one. The official prospectus, the document for investors, actually mentioned risks of crime and corruption.
It admitted the government would keep control.
Explicitly. And yet, big financial players in London piled in. Enthusiastically.
So, connecting the dots, this kleptocracy doesn't just stay home, it spreads.
It metastasizes globally. Think about Ihor Kolomoisky.
The Ukrainian oligarch.
Right. Accused of funneling billions at a private bank, his own bank, and then using that money to buy things like a steel plant in Ohio. War and steel,
Wow. So a legitimate-looking investment in the U.S.
but allegedly funded by massive fraud back in Ukraine. It shows how this dirty money moves in ways that aren't about, normal business logic.
That sounds like Moneyland or Kleptopia, those terms people like Oliver Bullough use.
Exactly. These hidden channels, anonymous shell companies, offshore tax havens,
Yeah.
ways to move and hide fortunes, often stolen fortunes.
And it's not just sitting in offshore accounts. This money flows back into democracies.
Undermining the rule of law. Buy up real estate, investing in failing businesses, those whiskery deposits in banks. It corrodes things from within.
And this isn't just a Russia story, you said.
No, not at all. Hugo Chavez's Venezuela is another powerful example. A state basically turning into a criminal operation.
How so?
Systematically stripping state assets, looting resources, using fake paperwork, for instance, to get access to currency at preferential rates, then selling it on the black market for huge profits.
The scale must have been enormous.
Mind-boggling. Some estimates, like from a former minister, Giordani, went as high as $300 billion stolen over a decade.
And you could see it.
Applebaum describes seeing it in Caracas. Brand new apartment buildings, totally empty. Just concrete shells, basically vaults for laundered money.
And that money moved internationally, too.
Oh yeah, flowing into places like Miami. Venezuelan officials getting charged with laundering vast sums into property, luxury goods. It's a global network.
But didn't Chavez project this image of, like, a socialist revolution helping the poor?
Absolutely. Skillful propaganda. Just like Putin, they built this positive narrative, the Bolivarian Revolution. It even attracted admirers internationally, particularly on the left. Figures like Hans Muldrow, Jeremy Corbyn.
That really shows the power of controlling the story, doesn't it?
It does, because while the elite was getting incredibly rich, ordinary Venezuelans were suffering terribly.
Shortages.
Severe shortages of everything. Food, medicine, widespread malnutrition. There were even reports of pressure to hide how bad the crisis really was. Groups like Caritas, experts like Susana Rafali, they documented the devastation.
And just like Belarus, Venezuela wasn't isolated either.
Not really. They got crucial support from that same network of autocracies.
Like who?
Cuba provided security forces in exchange for oil. China supplied surveillance tech. Iran and Russia invested in their oil sector, gave loans. Turkey apparently helped with illicit gold trading.
Wow. It's a club.
A club with benefits. There are even examples linking Venezuelan oil deals, Chinese buyers, and U.S. components ending up in Russian weapons used in Ukraine.
A direct line from kleptocracy to war.
It shows how interconnected it all is.
And it stretches beyond just those countries, right? You mentioned Zimbabwe.
Yeah, the Hubert Angel case, highlighted in that Gold Mafia documentary.
He's a preacher and an ambassador.
An ambassador at large, yeah. Allegedly using his diplomatic status to facilitate massive gold smuggling.
And where's the gold go?
Through what they call bridging jurisdictions. Places like the UAE, Turkey. Countries with, let's say, more flexible financial regulations that make it easier to move illicit goods and money.
And this is tied to politics.
Deeply. Angel's close links to the ruling party in Zimbabwe show how this kind of kleptocracy helps keep regimes in power. These bridging places enable it.
We're even seeing shifts in places that used to be more open, aren't we? Like Kyrgyzstan.
That's a worrying trend. Kyrgyzstan had a relatively free press for the region. There's been a noticeable slide towards authoritarianism. And it seems to coincide with an influx of Russian money and crackdowns on independent media, like the outlet Club.
So dirty money can actually erode democratic spaces.
It empowers the authoritarians, makes transparency harder. It's a stark contrast to, say, the initial promises in Zimbabwe under Mugabe.
Right, liberation didn't benefit everyone.
No, instead you got a new class of oligarchs grabbing opportunities. And in that kind of environment, figures like Hubert Angel promising miracle money, well, they find fertile ground.
And China's role in Zimbabwe.
It's a long-standing relationship. The ruling party and the Chinese Communist Party go way back. China invests heavily now, provides surveillance tech.
And Zimbabwe has minerals China needs.
Exactly. Minerals for technology, surveillance systems. It's mutually beneficial, reinforcing autocratic control.
Okay, so we've talked about the greed, the kleptocracy binding these regimes. But you also mentioned controlling the narrative. That's just as important.
Absolutely crucial. Think about the contrast back in 1989. Eastern Europe sees communist regimes collapsing.
But in China, Tiananmen Square happens, the crackdown.
That was a defining moment for the Chinese leadership. They decided that suppressing not just protests, but the ideas free speech, democracy was vital for survival.
Which led to the Great Firewall.
A massive effort to control the internet, censor information, and initially some Western tech companies were involved.
They helped build it.
To varying degrees, yes. Companies like Microsoft, Yahoo, Cisco saw access to the Chinese market as the priority, and they cooperated with censorship and surveillance demands early on.
And that surveillance has become incredibly advanced now, hasn't it? Especially in Xinjiang.
Unbelievably sophisticated. Mandatory apps on phones, tracking everything, voice recognition, DNA collection, targeting the Uyghur population. It's intense control.
And that tech could spread.
This safe city technology, as they call it, absolutely has the potential to be rolled out across China.
And the scary thing is, when democracies use surveillance too, it gives cover to the autocrats, right?
It does. It muddies the waters. And when China exports this surveillance tech, it can create political alignment. Countries using Chinese systems might be less likely to criticize Beijing.
Autocrats are also pretty good at using social issues, culture wars.
Oh, yes. Look at Museveni in Uganda. Using anti-gay laws to whip up domestic support, deflect criticism. Or Orban in Hungary, constantly focusing on cultural grievances to distract from corruption or power grabs.
And just dominating the conversation.
Like Chavez being on TV constantly in Venezuela, every channel. It kind of prefigured Trump's use of social media later on.
And they use lies, blatant lies.
These national fictions, it's not always about convincing people the lie is true. Sometimes it's just about showing power. I can say this and you can't do anything about it. It creates fear.
Applebaum calls it the fire hose of falsehoods.
Exactly. Bombarding people with so much disinformation, so many contradictions, that they just give up trying to find the truth. It breeds nihilism, apathy. Why bother with politics? It's all lies anyway.
We see that with Russian propaganda about Ukraine, don't we?
All the time. And it gets amplified by China, by parts of the far right globally. It's not just aimed at Europe or the U.S., it's pushed hard in Africa, Latin America, Asia, too.
China has its own influence methods, too, right? Sharp power.
Yeah, things like the United Front Department, the Confucius Institutes, trying to shape culture, media, academic discussions subtly.
And media ownership.
Like StarTimes in Africa, a big Chinese-linked media provider. They prioritize Chinese content, news, entertainment. It subtly pushes a pro-China view.
And these autocratic media outlets work together.
They do. Places like Telesur in Venezuela, Hispan TV from Iran, Russia's RT, China's Xinhua. They share content, amplify each other's narratives, push disinformation, including wild conspiracy theories like about COVID origins.
There was that example of the fake story about the Taiwanese diplomat.
At Kansai Airport in Japan, yeah. A perfect example of how they can manipulate social media, exploit existing political divides, just to push their agenda.
And didn't Russia allegedly get involved in the Catalan independence movement?
There were allegations, yes. It shows how they can latch on to existing tensions in democracies and pour fuel on the fire, exaggerate divisions.
So beyond propaganda, they're trying to change the rules internationally.
Definitely. China pushes concepts like sovereignty and the right to development over universal human rights at the UN.
While Russia focuses more on changing the conversation.
Yeah, pushing ideas like multipolarity to challenge the US-led order.
And they create their own clubs?
Alternative institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, or BRICS, they might not be purely autocratic, but they often promote a vision of rule by law, where the state's authority comes first, not individual rights.
And sometimes they just ignore the rules completely, like Belarus forcing down that Ryanair plane.
A shocking example. Just blatant disregard for international law, norms, everything.
This disregard seems to extend to hunting down critics abroad. Transnational repression.
That's the term. Autocracies working together to silence people who fled. The SEO, for instance, has agreements on things like terrorism, separatism, extremism.
Vague terms.
Very vague. Easily used to justify going after political opponents, getting them deported back home. Countries like Thailand, Turkey have been accused of cooperating.
It seems to be getting more brazen.
It does. The assassination of Ronald Ojeda, a Venezuelan dissident in Chile, Rwanda constantly harassing its exiles, and India's alleged role in killing Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada.
What's the goal?
To eliminate critics, obviously, but also to intimidate everyone else, to show that nowhere is safe. And it degrades the rule of law in the democratic countries where this happens.
You mentioned Syria earlier. How did that fit in?
Syria set some terrible precedents, deliberately targeting hospitals, aid convoys, things protected by international law, and then using propaganda to discredit groups trying to document war crimes, like the OPCW chemical weapons watchdog.
Then the refugee crisis that followed.
That was exploited, especially by Russia, to destabilize European politics, fuel anti-immigrant sentiment.
And we're seeing more mercenaries now, proxies.
A huge trend. The Wagner Group is the most famous example. But Iran has its proxies too. Autocracies use them for military engagement without direct involvement.
What do they offer?
These military financial packages. They offer security, muscle, maybe training, in exchange for access to natural resources, gold, diamonds, oil, and political influence. Think Mali, Central African Republic.
Okay, so we've covered the greed, the narrative control, the international maneuvering. Now, how do they deal with actual pro-democracy movements, the activists? Applebaum calls it smearing the Democrats.
Right, and this is critical because these movements have learned a lot over the years. Gene Sharp's work, From Dictatorship to Democracy, was hugely influential.
The 198 Tactics of Nonviolent Resistance.
That's the one. And movements learn from each other.
Yeah.
The Philippines People Power Revolution inspired people in East Germany. They created their own symbols, too.
Like Solidarity's logo in Poland, Otpor's fist in Serbia.
Georgia's Rose Revolution, Ukraine's Orange Revolution. These symbols mattered.
And Havel's idea of living in truth.
It's so powerful. Just small acts of refusing to go along with the regime's lies could expose the whole system.
And activists today use tech, right?
Absolutely. Encrypted messaging, VPNs to get around censorship, social media for organizing, even crypto sometimes for funding. They adapt.
Hong Kong's protests showed that sophistication, didn't they?
Hugely sophisticated, building on lessons from the earlier umbrella movement, constantly innovating tactics.
Even seemingly spontaneous things can catch on, like that #ThisFlag movement in Zimbabwe.
Evan Mawar's campaign, yeah. Started as just one guy venting frustration online with the flag around his neck, but it resonated, became a unifying symbol for discontent, shows the power of grassroots movements.
But the regimes fight back hard. How?
A key tactic is smearing these movements as foreign-controlled, saying they're puppets of the West, funded by the CIA, whatever.
Russia does that constantly.
Blamed Hillary Clinton for protests in Moscow, portrayed Ukrainian protesters in Maidan as just pawns of the U.S. and Europe. It aims to delegitimize genuine grievances.
And they go after individuals, like Mawar.
They use what Applebaum calls civil death tactics. It's brutal, non-stop public smear campaigns online and in state media, financial harassment, freezing accounts, audits, travel bans, arrests on trumped-up charges, imprisonment, torture.
The goal is to break them.
Break them and scare everyone else. These regimes, deep down, often can't believe in genuine idealism. They assume everyone must have a hidden, usually corrupt, motive.
And sometimes it's worse than smears. Assassinations.
Targeted killings, Jamal Khashoggi, Oswaldo Payan in Cuba, journalists like Anna Politkovskaya, politicians like Boris Nemtsov, and, of course, Alexei Navalny most recently. Lin Zhao in China, decades ago. It sends a chilling message. Dissent can be fatal.
But you said they often prefer smears now. Why?
To avoid creating martyrs. An assassination can sometimes backfire, galvanize opposition. Look at how hard Russia tried to control Navalny's funeral, prevent it from becoming a rallying point. Smears aim to discredit, isolate, demoralize.
Well, like using fake corruption charges.
Exactly. Against opposition leaders like Leopoldo Lopez or Henry Capriles in Venezuela or Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar. Even if everyone knows the charges are bogus,
It still muddies the waters.
it distracts from the regime's own massive corruption. And it fosters cynicism. See, they're all corrupt. It makes people less likely to support any opposition.
And this does discourage people from getting involved.
It absolutely can. Applebaum notes how participation in movements in Zimbabwe dropped off after Mawar was targeted so relentlessly. People see what happens and get scared.
And the online attacks, the troll farms.
State-sponsored harassment campaigns, using armies of real people and fake accounts like the Saudi Army of Flies to drown out critical voices, create this false sense of overwhelming public opposition to dissent.
That must be devastating for the targets.
Personally devastating.
Yeah.
Isolating. It can destroy relationships, careers.
And the worrying thing is, we're seeing similar tactics used even within democracies now.
That's a really crucial and chilling point Applebaum makes. When democratically elected leaders start using online mobs, state resources, to attack critics, judges, election officials.
Like in Poland or Trump's attacks.
Yes. It's a major warning sign. Shows democratic norms eroding.
And her final warning on this is pretty stark.
Yeah, she says basically, the lines blur completely. The blending of the autocratic and democratic worlds is finished if leaders in democracy successfully turn state power en masse trolling against their enemies.
Wow. Okay, so given all this, this interconnected network, these tactics.
Yeah.
What's the response? How can democracies push back? That leads to your final section, Democrats United.
Right. And it starts, interestingly, with another image from Applebaum pro-democracy activists gathering outside Vilnius, Lithuania.
A symbol of connection on the other side.
Exactly. People from different countries, facing different regimes, but sharing similar experiences. They understand these tactics intimately. Timothy Cho from North Korea was there, among others from Belarus, Russia, Venezuela.
And they believe they can make a difference.
They believe that by working together, sharing information, supporting each other, they can influence the debate in places like Washington, Brussels, Silicon Valley. They see it as one fight for democracy everywhere.
But the landscape is different now than when Gene Sharp was writing.
Yeah, totally different. The information space is fractured. There's no single global public square anymore. So they know they need new strategies, new ways to frame the problem and get their message across.
Because the autocrats certainly see the world as interconnected.
They absolutely do. They operate across all domains, political, economic, military, informational, pursuing their goals.
Like Russia backing far-right groups in Europe.
Or Iran using its proxies across the Middle East. Belarus weaponizing refugees against Poland and Lithuania. Cuba getting involved in Venezuela and even sending troops reportedly to fight for Russia in Ukraine. China's interests are global,
And they seem to coordinate their timing.
or at least opportunistically take advantage of global chaos. Like when aid to Ukraine was blocked in the U.S. Congress, you suddenly saw the Hamas attack, the Houthi attacks ramping up.
Not necessarily one big conspiracy.
Probably not. More like different actors seeing an opportunity, knowing that creating multiple crises stretches democratic resources and attention thin. Azerbaijan taking Nagorno-Karabakh while the world was distracted. Chinese hacking attempts, Russian influence buying in Europe. It creates this feeling of polycrisis.
And their shared goal is clear.
Undermining democracies. Remember that joint statement by he and Putin in 2022? Denouncing interference in the name of democracy and human rights. They want a world safe for autocracy.
And some use even stronger language.
Oh, yeah. Kim Jong-un, Dmitry Medvedev, talking about destroying democratic enemies. The rhetoric is extreme.
So what can the democratic world actually do? What are the strategies?
Applebaum focuses a lot on tackling the kleptocracy first. More transparency, real estate ownership, who really owns companies.
Shining a light on Moneyland.
Exactly. Banning financial dealings with secrecy havens. Strengthening enforcement against money laundering. And crucially, international coordination. Democracies need to work together on this.
But that's hard, isn't it? There's resistance.
Huge resistance. It's complex, technically. Governments can be ambivalent, maybe they benefit indirectly. And powerful interests, financial industries, lobbying groups, benefit from the current opaque system.
Senator at White House's point.
Right, that the same secrecy enabling foreign kleptocrats also helps powerful domestic interests hide their influence and money.
So it needs more than just government action.
It needs a real international coalition. Government officials, yes, but also community leaders, activists, journalists. People like Navalny were so effective because they could explain complex corruption in ways people understood, expose it relentlessly.
Are governments trying to expose disinformation now?
Some are stepping up. The U.S., France, Germany have started calling out Russian and other state-backed influence ops more publicly.
And social media reform, that seems key.
Absolutely vital.
Yeah.
These platforms are still major vectors for autocratic propaganda and manipulation. But reforming them is incredibly difficult.
Why?
The power of the tech companies themselves, political resistance to regulation, often framed as a free speech issue, it's a huge challenge.
What about supporting independent media? Those counter-narratives.
Crucial. Supporting diaspora media, independent outlets that can get information back into closed societies. Groups like Kloop in Kyrgyzstan, Meduza, and the Insider for Russia. They're lifelines.
And finally, the economic dependence issue, like Nord Stream.
That's the perfect example. Nord Stream wasn't just about gas. It created political leverage for Russia, opened doors for corruption, divided Europe.
So the argument is reduce dependence on autocracies for essential things.
Yes, critical minerals, energy, technology components. Applebaum argues it's not just economics, it's national security. It's about protecting the integrity of democratic authorities from autocratic leverage and corruption.
So bringing it all together, this deep dive into Autocracy, Inc. really highlights how these regimes are connected, how they use money and narratives to stay in power, and the challenge they pose.
Yeah, bound by kleptocracy, united in controlling the story, actively working against democracy globally. It's a systemic challenge, not just isolated incidents.
And understanding these connections, these tactics, it's really vital for you, for anyone trying to make sense of the world today.
Absolutely. So maybe a final thought for you to chew on. How might this normalization of lawlessness, this blurring of lines between autocratic methods and what sometimes happens even in democracies,
Mm.
how might that be subtly affecting your own society? And what role can any of us play in pushing for more transparency, more accountability? Maybe check out some of the people and groups that you mentioned today to learn more.